At 7:42 in the morning on July 2, 1937, Fred Noonan tapped Amelia Earhart on the shoulder and pointed through the starboard window at a smudge of white coral breaking the endless blue of the Pacific. Howland Island sat exactly where the corrected radio frequency chart said it would be, and the Lockheed Electra 10E still had fuel for another hour of flight. For decades afterward, pilots and navigators would argue about the single adjustment that made the difference, a revised frequency table quietly passed along by a Pan-American radio operator in LAE, but the fact on that morning was simple enough. The Electra banked, lined up on the crushed coral strip the Works Progress Administration had graded months before, and touched down in a wash of dust and relief. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The USCGC Itasca, which in our own world spent days sweeping empty ocean for a vanished aircraft, instead pumped aviation fuel into Earhart's wing tanks while her navigator compared notes with the ship's radioman. By July 6, after stops in Hawaii and a final leg across the Pacific, the Electra rolled to a stop in Oakland. Earhart had become the first person to circle the world along the equator by air. But what almost nobody understood yet, what would take years to fully surface, was that the same careful, methodical woman who had just survived the hardest navigation problem in aviation was about to apply that mindset to something far larger than any airplane. The parades came first. New York emptied its office windows of paper on July 19th, and Chicago and San Francisco followed within the month. George Palmer Putnam, her husband and publisher, had a manuscript contract signed before the confetti had been swept. The resulting memoir, released in the spring of 1938, sold briskly and did something her earlier books had not quite managed. It argued in plain language that the United States was dangerously behind in aviation infrastructure, in pilot training, and in the industrial base required to build modern aircraft at scale. Earhart spent 1938 and 1939 on lecture circuits and radio broadcasts, returning again and again to the theme of preparedness. She was careful never to sound like a partisan. Kansas, reliably Republican through the decade, had nonetheless elected progressive figures such as Alf Landon, and Earhart's Atchison roots gave her a foothold there that more conventional politicians lacked. When the 1940 Senate race opened, she ran as an independent-minded Democrat, quietly endorsed by Franklin Roosevelt and openly admired by enough moderate Republicans to carry the state. She arrived in Washington in January 1941 as the junior senator from Kansas, 43 years old, with a voice the nation already trusted. Aviation, in the Senate of 1941, was the stepchild of the Military Affairs Committee, folded among cavalry appropriations and coast artillery reorganizations. Earhart spent her first months hearing transcripts dating back to the Mitchell Court-Martial of 1925, and she arrived at a conclusion that had become obvious to Hap Arnold and nearly every serving air officer. The committee structure itself reflected an outdated assumption that air power was simply another branch of the ground army. She persuaded the majority leadership, after careful lobbying through the summer, to establish a new subcommittee on aviation affairs with jurisdiction over procurement, training, and doctrine. She chaired it herself. The hearings that autumn drew Henry Arnold, Carl Spaatz, and several officers who had served under Billy Mitchell before his death in 1936. The testimony was measured and, in its own way, devastating. American aircraft production lagged Germany's pilot training pipelines were starved. The lines of authority between Army and Navy aviation overlapped so badly that procurement contracts sometimes canceled each other out. Earhart listened more than she spoke, but she was drafting, in private, the outline of a bill. Then came December 7th, 1941. Then came the Philippines. The fall of Clark Field, where rows of B-17s were caught on the ground hours after Pearl Harbor, became the single clearest argument for reform that Earhart would ever need. In February 1942, she introduced the Air Force Unification Act, a bill that would pull the Army Air Corps out from under the War Department's ground-centric command and establish a co-equal service. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, opposed it in writing, arguing that wartime was no moment to restructure command. Ernest King, at the Navy Department, raised procedural objections designed to stall rather than defeat. But the political weather had shifted. Earhart worked the Senate floor with a discipline her colleagues did not expect, trading amendments for votes and carving carve-outs for naval aviation that neutralized King's resistance without surrendering the core of the bill. Robert Taft led the isolationist opposition and lost a vote he had expected to win. The act passed in the late spring of 1942, 3 years ahead of the schedule that in our own history the National Security Act of 1947 would set. Hap Arnold became the first Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force in June 1942. He moved characteristically with speed. Within 90 days, he had consolidated training commands that had previously reported through 3 separate chains, standardized procurement specifications across fighter and bomber programs, and established a single doctrine office responsible for integrating the lessons that Sparts and Ira-Ika were already beginning to send back from England. The reorganization was not painless. Several Army ground officers felt, with some justification, that they had been cut loose from assets they considered their own. But Arnold's headquarters did something the divided system had never managed. It spoke with one voice. When American planners began preparing for the Casablanca Conference in the winter of 1942, they arrived at the drafting tables with a unified position rather than a compromise hammered out between competing bureaucracies. The consequences of that single change would ripple through every strategic bombing decision of the following 2 years. But first, the Allies had to agree on what the air war actually was. At Casablanca in January 1943, the combined bomber offensive was formalized. In our own history, the directive split the work between American daylight precision bombing and British night area bombing, with each side pursuing its doctrine in parallel and often in tension. In this timeline, the American negotiators arrived with something different. Because Arnold's staff had already integrated its own planning, the U.S. delegation could offer the British a coordinated round-the-clock concept in concrete terms, with shared target selection committees and common intelligence pipelines. Air Marshal Arthur Harris remained skeptical, as he always would. But the compromise that emerged from Casablanca tilted slightly toward coordination rather than parallel effort. Target lists were negotiated jointly. Bomb damage assessment was pooled. The change was not dramatic on paper. In practice, it meant that a German ball-bearing plant struck by daylight was often revisited the same night, and that losses on both sides of the Atlantic began to be evaluated against a single strategic ledger. The second consequence of unified procurement revealed itself over the skies of Germany. The P-51 Mustang, in our own history, did not appear in meaningful numbers as a long-range escort until late 1943, and the standardization of external drop tanks lagged behind the aircraft itself. In this timeline, a single Air Force procurement office, freed from the Army-Navy redundancies that had slowed contracts throughout 1941 and 1942, pushed Mustang production forward by several months and standardized drop tank fittings across fighter groups by the autumn of 1943. The first deep escort missions reached Schweinfurt and Regensburg before the operation that, in our timeline, would be remembered as Big Week. Bomber losses did not disappear. The air war remained brutal, and the costs fell heavily on crews whose training pipelines were still catching up to demand. But the attritional curve that had nearly broken the 8th Air Force in the autumn of 1943 bent earlier, and the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots were drawn into a war of attrition against American escorts months sooner than Berlin had planned for. And then came the decision that would define everything that followed the war. As the war drew toward its end, Earhart turned her attention from wartime expansion to the harder question of what to preserve. The American military establishment of 1919 had collapsed almost overnight into irrelevance, and she was determined that the Air Force not repeat the pattern. Through 1944 and into 1945, she shepherded a sequence of bills that reformed civil aeronautics regulation, funded the skeleton of a peacetime pilot training system, and shaped the debates that would eventually produce a National Security Act closer in form to what the country actually got in our own history, but anchored this time on a service that had already existed for 3 years. Marshall, now nearing the end of his active service, made peace with the new arrangement. King continued to defend naval aviation and largely succeeded. Earhart herself re-elected in 1946, remained cautious in her claims. She had been a pilot long enough to know that no instrument reading was ever quite as clean as the chart suggested, that every flight plan concealed assumptions that might not hold. The Air Force she had helped to build was not obviously better than the one history had produced. It was earlier and differently shaped, and the long work of judging it belonged to someone else. What remained, in the end, was the corrected frequency chart, the dot of coral on the horizon, and the small margin of fuel that had once separated one world from another.